Okay, thank you, Brian, and really great to be here and see all of the people in this room who are working on and advocating on this very important topic, prescribed burning. Everybody knows, well, not everybody, but this room certainly understands that the cedar tree problem is a major issue. As a grassroots person involved with literally at the grassroots ranching, grazing, I have seen it absolutely devastate my ranch. I'm a little embarrassed that I'm sort of late in coming to prescribed burn, but I finally arrived, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to tell my story. Before I get started, though, I want to make sure I thank some of the critical people that have helped me on this journey over the last 4 or 5 years. And I want to start with my friends over at the NRCS office in Broken Bow, Lisa McMillan. And Lisa has spent really 2 decades trying to get me sort of on the right path on a number of projects involved. We've worked on a number of equip programs, and Lisa has a great sense of humor. She's really good at dealing with some obnoxious customers like myself who always want things done yesterday and wander into her office and take up time sometimes, more time than I should. But Lisa, you've been terrific over the years. I've really enjoyed working with you. Abby Tilley has recently joined that office, and she's been out now helping. I won't mention all the other people before Abby, but we've had a number of people come out to the ranch from the NRCS office in Broken Bow. I also want to thank Brian Teeter, obviously, and Pheasants Forever. Our little new burn association, the South Loop Burn Association, which we recently established, has a Pheasants Forever trailer. And so that's sort of a foundational piece of what we hope is going to be an expanding equipment list as we start to grow our little burn association there around Callaway and Oconto. Doug Wiesenhunt. Doug is a longtime friend. Doug is probably I know Doug was the first guy to actually tell me, and this was 20 years ago, embarrassingly, Jim, you need to start burning those dang cedar trees. And I just, it's taken me 2 decades or almost 2 decades to get there, but Doug has come out and helped on my first 2 burns, sort of helped lead that effort. And so I really want to make sure I thank him. And another guy, and you all know him, and I assume he's here, or if he isn't, Mark Alberts. Mark has, I've only known Mark for a couple years, but Mark has really taken me under his wing. He's come up to Callaway and our ranch on a number of occasions and helped to mentor me and the other people involved with our association. So at the end of the day, one of the reasons I didn't burn is that it just never seemed like a good idea to me to go out and light my ranch on fire, It just didn't seem like that was a good thing to do. I was scared of fire, worried about what might happen if it got over on the neighbors. You guys know the story, but that's why mentorship and sort of getting involved with burning and understanding that when it's done, planned out well and done, it can be done safely. Now, we all know that if you burn long enough, you're going to have a few spillovers, and it's not perfect, but let me tell you this, life is not perfect. Everything we do involves some risk, right? Driving down the highway involves some risk. So I've told my neighbors and friends, look, it's not perfect, but those cedar trees taking over our ranches are causing tremendous economic damage. We have to take a little risk, and so we have to do that when we burn. Just a quick introduction. Our ranch has got a long history. We're one of the first ranches established up in Custer County. In fact, Custer County was actually organized on our ranch. My great-grandfather was the first judge of Custer County, and so we've been there since 1876. In fact, there's kind of a story that ties to this topic. My ancestors first dug a dugout, built a dugout into the side of a hill. That was the first place they lived, but within about a year, they built a cedar log house, little cedar log house. And as the story goes, they had to drive all the way up to Victoria Springs, which is 20, 25 miles northeast of our ranch, to actually find cedars to build the cedar log cabin on my ranch. And that cedar log cabin has now been relocated and preserved in the town of Callaway. And so it's interesting. If you go back to 1870, 1880, 1890, 1900, there were no cedar trees, partly because the railroad logged quite a few trees off within 40, 50 miles of the railroad, but mostly because, of course, fire and buffalo and the fact that we didn't have a bunch of shelter belts. And I understand we have several shelter belts on our ranch. Those shelter belts are wonderful, but they do contribute to this infestation that we're having. We run principally cattle, yearlings actually. We're not a cow-calf operation. We do a lot of rotational grazing. As Brian mentioned, we started into the sheep business a few years ago just as an experiment. I started out with this slide because this is a beautiful, wide open pasture. You can see there's not very many cedar trees, and I know this picture's, I'm not the best photographer, but anyhow, this is the way our landscape should look and did look back in 1850. Up until probably the 1950s, you had pretty open landscape. Now, I'm not in the sand hills, I'm what they call the loess hills, so we have a much greater carrying capacity than my sand hill friends. Really high quality grass. We have well over 100 species of plants on this ranch. It's just really high powered grazing land, but it's now, of course, being severely impacted by cedar trees. So cedars love the loess hills of Custer County. These hills we have a lot of canyons, rugged canyons, tables. And you can just see this is actually a view of my second burn, which happened this year. I should have taken a picture. I should have gone out there and taken a picture. Those trees now are all burned up, and so. But that is typical of the landscape up in my neighborhood, and I can tell you. I've done cutting for my father and I have done cutting for about 20 years, and it just seems like we've made no headway at all using a skid steer and cutting. Now we have cut hundreds of acres, as Lisa can attest. She's been out and monitored it, but I can just tell you one reason we went to fire is because cutting has not worked. Just another kind of winter picture of cedar tree infestation. I kind of spread this picture out. Those trees look a little funky as I tried to fill up the screen, I guess, but you could just see that another pasture of mine were cedar trees. If you just sit here and do nothing for the next 5 or 10 years, you're going to see another, 20, 30% of that pasture covered with cedars. So I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is my list. I'm sure you could add to it, but cedar trees are absolutely devastating to our ranching economy and wherever they're prevalent, certainly in the loess hills. You go out here south of North Platte, they have similar problems. But throughout much of, from Oklahoma up through Nebraska, a lot of cedar tree problems. And I'm always amazed because if you were a corn farmer and something happened to your cornfield, let's say you have 1,000 acres of corn, and year by year, you gradually lost the ability to farm those 1,000 acres, and pretty soon you're only farming 800 acres. Do you think any corn farmer would let that happen to his or her cornfield? Heck no. But we ranchers, it's almost like, we'll just sort of let those trees, they're part of the natural habitat, but when you get 20 or 30% infestation or more, it's doing economic damage, and I'll talk more about that as I go forward. Obviously, the biodiversity, we all know that there's nothing growing under those cedar trees. I know because I've crawled around under them trying to get cattle and sheep and checking fence. I mean, there's nothing growing in there. There's a few critters that will live in those cedar trees, but you know, it's horrible for all of our grassland bird population. It's horrible for our grasses. It's horrible for the water, which I've noted here, the soil health, the fuel load. You want to see a big fire get going, get a bunch of cedar trees. And it happened on our ranch. One of the best things that happened to us late in the grazing season in 2012, which is a horrible drought year, a beekeeper was smoking out his bees, and he decided to do it on a 100-degree day with about a 30-mile-an-hour wind coming out of the southwest, and he very nicely burned up about 700 or 800 acres of my pasture. Of course, he burned up a bunch of fences too, but the fact is, all those cedars created a huge fuel load. And so that's a problem in and of itself. It creates a greater threat in terms of controlling wildfires. Livestock management, a lot of people don't talk about this. I don't know how many of you have actually gone out into a cedar pasture and tried to round up cattle. I guarantee you, we never get all of our cattle out of our cedar pastures. No matter how, we might go back 3 or 4 times. Sometimes they stay there all winter. We'll go back and find 2 or 3 that we just never could get out. So the labor of finding your cattle, observing your cattle, moving your cattle, it's a big issue. One of the other things that happen, of course, and we lease, we have about 5,000 deeded acres, but we also lease another 3,000 acres. Most of it pasture. And the landlord wants so much per acre or so much per season, and the cedars just keep taking up more and more of his pasture, and he doesn't do anything. And as a result, you know, he wants the same money, but he's got less pasture, and it puts pressure on me as the tenant. I'm trying to make the pasture work for me, and so I can tell you that there's a lot of cedars that are being, or a lot of pastures being overstocked because of cedar growth happening in those pastures. And then, of course, you've got labor and equipment costs. Once you let them get out of control, which I have, or did, even though we have worked on them for about 20 years of cutting, the labor and equipment costs, as you know, are horrific. So this is my quick list. I don't know if you can read this as to kind of what happened in my journey towards prescribed burning. You can see number 1, and I hate to stand up here in front of this audience and tell you this, the first thing I did was nothing for 20 years, okay? Or my family and I did nothing. It was, I'll throw my father under the bus too on that deal. Then we began cutting trees for the last 20 years. And we would be pretty diligent. We have a nice, I'll show you later, we've got a beautiful bobcat skid steer with, not a bobcat, it's a cat skid steer with tracks on it. So we began to do that. Then we would watch those trees grow back. 7, 8 years later, you'd have trees 3, 4. And then what happened, we'd have to take the brush hog out and brush hog those trees. And then, of course, at that point, I was becoming rather depressed. I'd literally go out in my pastures riding around on my horse, and I'd look at this. I just cannot tell you how depressing it is to see those darn cedars encroaching on your pastures. So finally, we started to really document, with the help of Lisa and her staff, started to really document the cedar infestation. And we might have done it earlier in 2017, but we started creating maps and putting a plan together and began to talk about burning. Finally signed up for, in 2018, signed up for an equipped cedar tree removal plan. I don't know if that's the official title, Lisa, but it's a 3-year plan where we're putting, so we signed up for 3 years of doing some 3 burns. 2019, I went to burn school, and it was then I started to see how you can organize a burn. I just knew nothing about it. And so I spent a day long, Brian was there, Doug was there, I believe, really good session, a day-long session on how to put together a burn. Then I began to sort of put together mentors, I started contacting burn leaders, probably interacted with 4 or 5 different burn associations, went to some meetings, and of course then started to go out and actually attend burns. I'm a busy guy. I'm in the ranching business. It's kind of 6 or 7 days a week, but I did get out to probably 6 or 7 burns. And once you see a burn, and a well-organized burn, I think I was out on a burn. I'm embarrassed. I can't remember which one, but Scott Stout and his crew. I think I was down here south of North Platte on my first burn. I have a slide later on. I'll show you. But I saw them burn, I think about 1,400 acres. And I couldn't believe it. They put the fire on the ground, I think around 10 o'clock, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon, everything was being mopped up and 1,400 acres burned, and it was pretty eye-opening experience. Then I began recruiting friends and neighbors, and this is the hard part. All the burn associations are really busy. If they're well organized, they've got a whole bunch of people that want to burn. They don't have a time to come up and help some guy that's maybe 30 miles away from their burn association. Now, I'm not saying individuals won't leave their own burn association and come up and help, which they have, but it's just tough to get started because everybody in the burn season, and you guys and gals all know this, there's only so many good burn days every year to burn. I mean, some days, some wet springs, there's not a lot of good days. So people are really focused on their burns during the burn season. So new people have to kind of cobble together the best group you can to find 30 or 40 people and enough equipment to burn. Of course, we put a burn plan together, working with Lisa and Doug and Brian. And then in 2021, we had our first burn. In 2022, just this spring, we had our second burn. So this map was put together. Abby Tilley at the NRCS office, Broken Bow, kind of put this map together, and this is where our 3 burns are going to happen. This year's burn, last year's burn, and then the burn next year. And it represents, this just shows you kind of the slope and all the red in that picture or photo shows you where the cedar tree infestation is. This is the worst infestation on our ranch. And I kind of put together a little chart here. This is sort of a bit of an estimate. We didn't quantify absolutely precisely, but I don't think we're too far off. So we had 1,166 acres that we're planning to burn in 3 burns. And of those acres, we think about 347 had 30% tree cover. That may actually be a little low. I tried to make this a little bit conservative. I think my problem's a little bit worse actually than, and in talking to Lisa before this program and going over this with her, she thinks I might have underestimated a bit. But anyhow, what this demonstrates is that you've got 213 acres of cedar tree coverage, and I'm guessing that's about 18%. You can see that 18%. So call it 20%. It could be a little higher. It could be 25%. So think about that. I've got a major part of my ranch, grazing lands, covered with 20 to 25% cedar trees. Now the pasture value up in Custer County, and this number is probably even a little low, but pasture land going from $1,500 to $1,700 per acre. So why would anyone think of going out and buying additional land, trying to find or rent additional land when you're sitting here with land that could be grazed, but it's covered by cedar trees? So you got $320,000 of land tied up in cedar coverage. And if you took an annual rent, and this is very close to what you'd have to pay, it's probably a little low this year, but $45 per acre. So that's a $9,000 to $10,000 hit that you would be taking. You take that over 10 years, that's $100,000. It's real money, and it's probably a little worse than that. As you can see, I just threw this in here. This was our primary cedar tree fighting tool for the last 20 years. And by the way, this is a great tool. You need this to do all the prep work. But for many years, as I said, we paid a lot of money either to private contractors or to one of our crew running this skid steer. And as you know, this is a very expensive machine, and you put a man or a woman in it, it becomes even more expensive as they work to try to clear cedar trees. A lot of our cedar trees are inaccessible to this machine. So this is very necessary and very important. We use it for our prep work, but I'm just telling you right now, anybody that thinks that cutting cedar trees, certainly on the land that I have or type of land, I just do not believe it can compare with fire. It's not even close. It's just not great. This, and again, I'm not the best photographer, but this was land that we cut probably 8 to 9 years ago. And you can see the cedars are now rapidly coming back in. If you're, my view of it is you better be burning about every 8 to 10 years. I've been told that, but I would certainly, from what I've witnessed, it's absolutely true that you better get ready to go back and burn every 8 to 10 years. Of course, it gets a lot easier the second time around, so I'm told. I believe that. But this is what happens. I've got spots all over my ranch. Let me see. This is another little area. We had all that little hillside cleared, and that was about 8 years ago. And you can see the cedars are just coming right back in. I've got patches like this all over my ranch. This is that burn I told you about. I included this picture because this was the first burn I'd ever witnessed down here south of North Platte, 1,400 acres. And it was really an eye-opening experience. Of course, one thing I was really impressed about was how much equipment these burn associations have, especially the ones that have been around for 20 years. My little neighborhood, we didn't have any of this kind of equipment. We had a few small little musk thistle, 50-gallon tanks that we could throw in the back. So we had to go out and figure out how to build skids and how to start, getting water tenders gathered up. The Pheasants Forever provides a couple skids in their trailer, so that was helpful. My view of it is if you're going to go out and burn 300 or 400 or 500 acres or more, you better have 6 or 7 or 8 sort of pumper trucks or larger units, and then of course back that up with a bunch of side-by-sides or four-wheelers with the smaller tanks who can spot and help back up the bigger trucks. So, but putting this equipment together is not easy. I mean, it takes time and money and effort and so forth. So here's my 2021 burn. It was 365 acres, and we had a terrific burn. Now, we did one heck of a lot of prep. In fact, I was very, very disappointed. I was hoping to burn in 2020, and the weather just wasn't right. My preparation wasn't quite right, but we had literally been cutting trees and prepping for probably 2.5 years on this burn, and not surprisingly, it was one heck of a burn. I think Brian told me that he said he'd seen burns of 1,000 acres or more that didn't put near as much smoke up as we put up in this 365 acre burn. I mean, it went well over a 90% kill. Came back this year, early April, and just went just to the south of that burn, the 21 burn, for another 230 acres. We expanded it out there to the north would be to the top, the east would be the west. I actually learned something. We really didn't plan this burn out as well as I should. It's not my fault, or it was my fault. Lisa's tried to get me to go safer routes, and I'm always, economics are a big thing. I don't want to give up a lot of pasture land to burning, or you kind of have to balance the grazing needs with the burning needs, and there's some tension there. But you can see I went out onto instead of coming down a ridge line, which put our equipment right close to some of those big deep canyons that sort of exposed us to some heat, we finally at the last minute went out and actually probably threw, I don't know, an extra 50 or 60 acres into the burn, so our fire equipment could easily and safely get around the burn. So one thing I'm learning through these burns is that putting a lot of thought and effort into how to safely get the equipment easily around the burn. Sometimes that we needed the cooperation on our first burn of one of our neighbors, but the planning and preparation, and again I'm preaching to the choir here, is really important. So there's just a look at part of our 2021 burn. You can see, if you look at that picture closely, you can see a lot of cedar trees laying on the ground. That was all done by chainsaw. And so one of my messages to my friends and neighbors is, I know it's hard, but you need to get a chainsaw in there and get some hot spots. What we do is we try to kind of cut up, we call the chimneys. So, if I have a pointer, but you can kind of see a little ravine that goes up there. We're trying to make sure that everywhere there's a little bit of a ravine that goes up, we're cutting trees down there so that you can get a pathway. We've learned that you don't want to just clear cut. It's not necessary. So trying to balance between clear cutting and knocking about every cedar tree down and sort of spacing out. It's a little bit of an art. It's kind of, you have to kind of get a feel for it. But the more you do, the better burn you're going to have. And again, all of you folks know that. But this is, you can see a few trees back here that we actually didn't do as much chainsaw work back here, just in this picture. And obviously we didn't get as good a burn. But again, well over 90%. Another look at it, see a few trees in there. But this, I could tell you that whole side of that table was just masked with cedar trees. And it's amazing what that fire did. And these trees were big trees. A lot of them were 30 feet tall. One of the things I want to talk about just briefly, and that is, we've really got into doing canyon burns in June. June, we typically, we have usually pretty good moisture in April, May, and June, so the grass is really green and growing. You cannot, most years, start a fire if your life depended on it the 1st of June. I don't care, you've got green growing grass. And so we went in here, this is just a small little burn we did just to experiment. We cut these trees down in March, and we went in here in June, and my wife really didn't think much was going to happen. She was saying, I don't think those trees are going to burn. You didn't cut them down that long ago. She and a friend were standing right next to that canyon. My brother and I lit that thing up, and she and her friend started running for the hills because it went up big time. It absolutely burn the head of that canyon out beautifully. So one of the things we're looking to do is those canyons that are sort of outside of our burn area, they're not conveniently located, we're going to go in there about every year and just try to do one canyon a year, knock some trees down. And, I just think that early June time frame for my part of the country is a good time to burn. I threw this picture in here because I've got the skid steer. I showed you that as an important element of our prep. But I can tell you this is a friend of mine, and this is part of, I think, being successful at burning. You've got to recruit people wherever you can to come in and help you. This is a old college friend of mine who flies for Delta Airlines and decided he wanted to come out for 4 or 5 days and run a chainsaw. And so we do, I've literally had people fly in from all over the country because they thought it was going to be fun to run a chainsaw for 4 or 5 days. And it's been kind of a fun thing. We've probably had 10 or 12 people come to the ranch and run a chainsaw for 3 or 4 days. So in conclusion, just to wrap things up, 90% plus kill on the first 2 burns. I have no doubt that we're going to have a burn at some point that we're not going to be as happy with. That's going to be life, but my view of it is if we just burn 200 or 300 acres a year on the size of our operation, over the next 10 years, we'll burn several thousand acres or more. And I think, literally I have about 2 more burns, and we will at least have the major infestation problems targeted and dealt with. So we had a little luck. We had some great weather on both of our burns. NRCS, Pheasants Forever, as I noted, have been instrumental. We put in significant preparation, lots of time and effort getting the burn ready to go. Had an experienced core crew, and thank goodness Brian brought up 4 or 5 members, I think, each year of his Pheasants Forever crew. Doug showed up. We had several people come in from other burn associations. Mark Alberts came up one year, the second year, this previous spring, to help out. So, my view of it is you need about 6 to 8 or 9 people on your initial burn if you don't have much experience. At this point, I still don't feel comfortable being the burn boss, but I think within the next couple of years, as I participate in more burns, not only my own but others, I think I'm going to be competent to run a fire. Obviously, you need plenty of equipment. You just cannot go into these burns short-staffed. In both of our burns, we had some spillovers. We had a burn, in our first year, we had fire get over into another canyon. Thankfully, it was out in the middle of my ranch, and so it didn't really matter. It burned up another, I called it bonus acres, but I did get a good feel for, oh yeah, that's what can happen. We also, in our last burn, we literally had embers go probably 250 to 300 yards into another pasture down by my creek. All of a sudden, one of my spotters got on the radio and said, we've got a fire going, way south of the burn line. And thankfully, we got over, and again, it was in the middle of my pasture, but, because we had enough people and spotters, we got it taken care of. So again, I want to thank all of you for everything you're doing. This is very important work. We need to make sure that our legislative and governmental people understand that burning is essential, and it's important that we continue to educate more and more people how devastating this problem is. So, thank you.